This is a very important conversation that we're having, right now with stuff that's happening in Texas.
It's quite clear that thorium would be a much safer way of
The
running
thing is
nuclear power,
that
is because when
there's
people were
not an
building nuclear
inherent
power stations,
problem,
they were like, "Ooh,
specifically regarding
uranium
this.
power
There's not an
stations will
inherent
also
problem
allow us
with
to make
windmills
nuclear weapons."
freezing
So
up.
it's very, very difficult for a thorium
It's
reactor to
sort of a
melt down, because
technological
uranium reactors are all solid,
fortification
and so things go wrong
that can
all
be
the time, all
made
moving parts
for
can get stuck, whereas
this
thorium can be
particular
done in a
technology
nuclear
itself.
loop.
Best
So if anything
example
goes wrong,
that
you
could
just
possibly be
drop the salts
given
out of the bottom,
that identifies this
and you can just like completely
is
shut down
that
the reactor
windmills
very,
are
very rapidly.
used in the Arctic. If
Nuclear fusion
windmills
is
can be
very, very
used in
good
the
in
Arctic,
terms of-
and not
in terms
just
of safety,
can
because
be, but are
nuclear fusion,
relied
if anything goes
upon
wrong, the whole
as
thing
a
just
core
immediately turns off.
energy
You need to put in
source
so much energy
in
to sustain
literal
this
Arctic conditions, because it's
The main place
literally
where they're
in the
doing nuclear fusion
Arctic,
is in the jet
then
facility
clearly
south of
the
Oxford,
technology
which
exists
I toured
to
years
have
ago just to
reliable,
see the stars, and it was really cool.
specifically wind power
Anyway, so
in
fusion,
under those
yeah,
conditions. So if you look at solar, for instance, with a lot of these solutions that we have to trying to transition away from traditional fossil fuels, you have people who will point out, and certain schools of thought that will point out issues with one or the other. Looking at the Arctic or more northern and southern climes, on the more extremes, you can't really rely on solar nearly as easily for certain portions of the year, right? Because you'll have, it'll be dark for half the year. It's just like nighttime perpetually. You get like half an hour of light. You obviously can't rely on that, but that doesn't mean that it's not useful in other parts of the world. We are not necessarily aiming for completely globalized universal solutions, one size fits all. It's circumstantial. It needs to be community oriented and local. So something that will work toward the equator. You have a number of ways in which solar can be very valuable and problematic. So if there's like one of the issues with solar is ground coverage. You have to cover quite a bit of ground in order to have a certain amount of energy production with solar. However, that is also based on the technological advancement, technological development of that specific resource. The solar panels themselves, they have an efficiency level, and this is also true of all energy production. There's a matter of how much energy is at the source and how much of that can we get from the source and then transition it into a usable resource of fuel. Most of the time with this conversation, it's a matter of getting it to become electricity. Fossil fuels invariably cannot be clean. The whole idea of there being a clean fossil fuel energy source is ultimately a branding and marketing scheme. Now, it can be, so y'all know I have lots of issues with terminology, how things get phrased. This is a terminological issue. It can be less bad, absolutely. Can it be, see, and this is where it's problematic, cleaner? Yes, it can be cleaner, as in like, if my entire house, if I haven't cleaned it in 2 years, could it be cleaner? Absolutely it could. But will it be clean if I just spend an hour picking up a few things? No, of course it won't. It will just be less dirty. I'll still have tons of stuff everywhere, it'll just be like less of that tons of stuff. So, taking that same discussion, that same point that you made, which is a big topic right now with the issues that are happening in Texas. So it's something like 13% of Texas energy comes from wind. And they did not invest, and for understandable reasons, they did not invest in basically freeze-proofing, ice-proofing the windmills. The windmills. We're churning grain here. The technology was not weatherproofed for specific weather conditions, which they are now experiencing. And part of the reason for this, they didn't have any reason to assume that this would be a problem. Right? It's like, this is Texas. A lot of Texas does not have ice like this for extraordinary, durations or extreme temperatures or these extreme conditions most of the time historically. This, however, is one of the things I wanted to talk about today that ties into the nature of climate change. You end up with more extreme weather events, right? Weather is temporary conditions that happen in the atmosphere and environment. Climate are trends of weather. So when you have the climate change stuff that we're experiencing currently, this kind of progression that we're seeing with climate change, you end up with more extreme weather. Weather being the temporary things, right? So you might have these huge heat waves, these big heat spikes, and then it might go back down to a totally normal condition. You might have these huge winter storms that are these like big, like just massive drops in temperature and pressure, and you get the ice stuff coming in, you got tornadoes flying around, all kinds of wild stuff, and then it totally goes back to normal, right? So, or to even like normal high temperatures, right? Like I was talking to my parents. They live down in Texas. I spent most of my life in Texas, various parts of Texas, pardon my puberty. And my parents were like, yeah, it's like -22 with wind chill right now, and then this weekend it's projected to be 70 degrees. Just talking about Fahrenheit. Projected to be 70 degrees. Now, 70 degrees is unusually warm for this time of year, but so is -22 with wind chill. Yeah, but both of these. So that's a high and a low that are both unusual for the assumptions we've had, the climate and projections that we make, you know, just psychologically moving forward. The climate that we've had historically in that region, those are both unusual. Drought is another really interesting subject to talk about when it comes to climate versus weather. Drought is something that technically requires a reduction in water from your assumed average over a period of time. Right? So you don't have a drought within a year. You could have like extreme weather conditions that prevent water from coming down within a year, but it's like 7 years or something. I don't, it changes depending on who you ask, but it's a period of time. So if you have no rain in an area that usually gets quite a bit of rain for 7 years at a time, and I'm just spitballing on that number, I don't take my word for it of what the actual number is, for 7 years of time, then now you're actually in a drought. Right? Or three years. I don't know what it is. Maybe you do have a drought within a year. Maybe what I'm doing is I'm flipping this around because I just triggered the next part of this conversation, which is that it's no longer a drought after it's been a certain period of time. Now it's just your climate in that region. That's what I really should have been saying this whole time. I might have misinformed you there on accident. Drought may be the really short-term temporary thing. It's certainly temporary. Drought by nature is temporary. But you now live in arid conditions if it's after a certain period of time. That might be 7 years, right? So you can have like probably just we have a drought this summer or whatever. After you have that for a while, now you just live in an arid climate. That's your climate now. And maybe you'll have a flood, you know, 1 year in there and it's like, oh, yes, it's returned. But then it goes right back the next year to like reduced rain. Nope, that's still an arid climate with an exceptional year of, you know, a dump of rain. Which is like it's this really interesting thing by itself to talk about the nature of climate versus weather and climate change with extreme weather conditions like what we see in our summers and in our winters and really all year round. It's something that, thank you, Chaos Winds, it's something that we are experiencing currently, which is part of the conversation that certainly needs to be had that I think a lot of people miss is that climate change issues are a problem for tomorrow, yet we regularly and constantly see the effects of climate change now. This is one of them. The more frequently you are getting these kinds of extreme weather events, the more you are seeing the effects of climate change. Of course, you get extreme weather events under normal conditions. That's the nature of an extreme weather event, right? But when you start getting them with great frequency, wildfires every summer when you didn't used to get them every summer, these massive winter storms that knock out the power grid every winter, or sometimes even in the spring or summer. We had weird summer, like winter storms in the summer this year. Very, very strange stuff, right? Like these extreme weather events are becoming more normal. They are less extreme because of the frequency. That's a climate change effect. We see that right here and now, which is a fascinating thing. But back to the fossil fuel conversation. Poorly maintained and ruggedized, right? Big problem. One of the huge issues that has been happening over this winter storm situation in Texas is that, and I don't know a lot of the specifics, a lot of the technical details, so forgive me if I'm wildly wrong. The concept I have, and the concept is that the infrastructure is poor in many ways to get energy, stored energy, like in the form of gas, to places and to because of the extraordinary weather conditions that they're experiencing. So pipelines, for instance, right? You have gas that comes in and then gets burned, and a turbine, heats stuff up, the water vapor, and it turns the turbine, and then that generates electricity. There's your basic overview for how coal plants work, for how gas stuff works. It's more detailed than all that. And there's, different technologies that kind of do some different things, so forgive me. But the gas comes in. You get a lot of problems when you have these extreme temperature changes with how much gas is able to flow. And then also, when it comes to extreme cold, with how some of the fittings and joints end up working. So you can end up losing a lot of that gas just to the atmosphere, and then you get a reduction in the pressure in the pipe that will shut off automated systems because the pressure's too low. And the same thing with like extreme heat, where you get like a real intensity of the pressure in the pipes, and you can get shutoffs. So when you don't have the proper technological investment in the infrastructure, in the flow of getting the trapped energy in some source, like in coal, like in gas, like in the wind, if you don't have the technological investment in like ruggedizing that stuff for these extreme weather conditions, then you don't get power, period. It doesn't matter what type of technology we're talking about, whether it's wind, like with freezing wind turbines, like with gas, when it comes to the pipe and flow issues. Those are things that have both happened this week in Texas that are partly responsible for the power outages. And it is a big freaking deal to point out that the emphasis that is being thrown around on wind power, it is incorrect emphasis, right? Is it true? Yeah, it's true that the wind stuff froze up and you couldn't get power from the wind stuff. Does that mean that wind power is unreliable in these extreme weather conditions? No, it doesn't. Again, pointing to the very easy example of wind turbines are the primary source of power at Arctic stations. Arctic, talking about the most extraordinary cold on the planet. It works. It's legit. It's functional. It does the job. Clearly, it can be done. You wouldn't invest in that in Texas because you wouldn't expect these kinds of conditions. It's like spending a ton of money for something that may or may not happen. So I understand why they didn't do that for the wind stuff in Texas. The pipeline's also incredibly expensive to ruggedize that stuff. You're talking about like a lot of miles of pipe that you have to it's pretty extraordinary. And as a business, when we're talking about like the free market and this capitalist, consumerism and the capitalistic approach, you want to cut your costs where you can and not have to account for extreme conditions that may never happen, right? Like that makes some sense from an abstract point of view. But now we're starting to face these extreme weather conditions that happen with these in unpredictable ways at unpredictable times, but that they're going to be happening more frequently. So we have to start accounting for that in our infrastructure. And a lot of that infrastructural stuff starts at the policy level. Policy is huge, and policy is determined by politicians. Politicians are determined by our votes. So you got to do that local voting stuff. What you do for your municipal area and for your state has a huge impact on the power that we as people can have on making these changes. I can't go out and ruggedize the pipeline. I can't go out and ruggedize the wind stuff. What I can do is put my power in that republic. We've got it built out. It's right there. We have people who represent us who make those decisions based on what we want to see. They run on platforms and are supposed to be doing the stuff that, we're effectively asking them to do by virtue of voting them in. That's incredibly valuable. I feel like every stream should set aside time to talk about the real world issues like this. We can't just play games all the time and ignore what's happening in the world. I don't think that every stream should do it, but I do think that some streams should do it, and I think that they should be emphasized. I think it's valuable to have places that you can go to that are escapes. I personally would love to see every community have this as a subject matter, but I also understand how anxiety works, and the fact that a lot of people simply cannot, at certain times, have these conversations. And, you know, you kind of get bombarded on accident when you're like, I was just here to chill and this is giving me anxiety and now I feel terrible and my week is ruined. That can happen from anxiety, right? It can trigger those kinds of spirals. So I think it's important to have places that you can go to where you can reliably relax, and other places that you can go to reliably have the conversations. Now, the conversation does need to be broader. I think the topic needs to show up in some capacity in communities. But I don't want to say, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't want to say that every community should have this conversation with regularity, you know, about these deep, profound existential issues. I think in a perfect world, it would be happening. But in a perfect world, we also wouldn't have anxiety that causes, you know, like these extraordinary... Yeah, exactly, Tech Noir. Finding the balance is very difficult. And I think that's part of cultivating the community that you want. Because for me, it's a lot of like, you know, intellectual discourse and the dialectic. It's having these conversations, and sometimes very difficult ones. That to me is vital. Like, I need that to be part of my business. My life is my business. My business is my life. These are important issues to me. I want to fold that into the community that is congregating around this stream. I want them to be part of who we are, is having these conversations. There's this really fascinating thing. So I think it's critical to exactly what he said, to not alienate people who disagree, or really to not try and alienate anybody when it comes to climate in particular, but you know, really just as like a general principle, and to approach things with empathy. But here's a really amazing example, and I talk about this from time to time. Do y'all remember, I don't know how old everybody is in here, and don't say your age. There was this time where there was this kind of shift in vehicles when it came to a conversation around burning fossil fuels, CO2 emissions from driving your vehicles. And the conversation was about fuel efficiency and what types of vehicles people were buying, and what they were driving, and the fact that we really needed to reduce those emissions because it was a big source. It turns out it's not as big as a bunch of people thought, but it doesn't really matter. It's one of the things that can be shifted. Huge conversation happened around this in the US, to say the least, of the rest of the world. I don't know if that's a phrase that makes sense, to say the least of the rest of the world, where environmentalists and environmentally minded people who were really pushing for we need to reduce the gas mileage and everything made a critical fucking mistake. And that critical mistake was alienating specifically SUV drivers. This is something that gets swept under the rug. A conversation that is not often had is this critical failure. Thinking to myself as an environmental minded person, or it's like a big focus of my life, we started just trash talking SUV drivers. And we were like, y'all are killing the planet. Y'all are a problem. You're messing up. You are driving this gas-guzzling hog that is destroying future generations. What world are your children going to live in when it's, you know, all the ice is melted, all the forests are burned? You're doing this. Here's part of why that was a big problem, and that it's a lesson that should be learned. People who drive SUVs think of themselves, oftentimes, and certainly back then, it wasn't so much of a family car. That was part of the thing. But it was like, if you wanted a family car, you got a wagon. You know, you got some van or something. If you thought of yourself as outdoorsy, whether or not you went outdoors is irrelevant, right? This is just part of consumerism, is we fantasize about the life that we want and buy things related to that. I think of, and we try to express ourselves through our purchases, right? So that people can see who we are by virtue of what duvet cover we have, you know, or what car we drive, or what books we have on the shelf, right? You walk into my house, you get an instant idea of who I am because you see all the philosophy stuff over there and you see this art over there, right? It builds up this, the externalization of externalities is a really good point to make too, in terms of capitalism, consumerism, and corporations and the environmental stewardship. Anyway, it's externalizing our personality, and we do that with our cars. It's a huge investment, and we're like, I'm gonna buy this thing that shows everybody who I am on the inside, what I like to do. Am I fun and sporty? Am I really about like safety, and I've got the kids and I got the soccer mom vehicle? Or, you know, am I like outdoorsy and woodsy, and I got the SUV that's got the 4-wheel drive and stuff, and like I can put, you know, my surfboard on the top, and I can put my mountain gear in the back. And of course, I don't do any of those things, but it doesn't really matter because it's just about expressing my personality through my purchase so that everybody can see who I am. That was a huge deal for SUV drivers. They thought of themselves, whether or not they did the outdoorsy stuff, they thought of themselves as, I like the outdoors. You know, I want to be able to, on a whim, just be able to go out to the mountain. SUV will do the trick for me, right? They don't do it. It doesn't matter. It was expressive. And that was critical in this exact conversation because the environmentalists, myself among them, made this huge mistake by alienating a group of people who had extraordinary purchasing power, middle-class America, who had extraordinary economic force, inherently alienating them, not just in terms of a thing that they bought. They felt attacked, right? They were like, no, what do you mean I don't care about that? Of course I do. That's why I bought the vehicle in the first place. But suddenly, I'm the enemy because I own an SUV. That creates extreme thinking. That is polarizing. And that is critical to how communication functions for all of these kinds of topics. You want to not create these polarizing identity level distinctions between us and them, where they are on the other side of the conversation, because what happens with that is they then see themselves in that same way. The them part of this, right? No matter what it is you're talking about, the tribalism is a problem. They are then your enemy. They define their values in opposition to yours, which now means in this conversational flow, in this dialogue, in this dialectic, the us and them mentality, they are now anti-environmentalism. They may have been amazing allies, but they are now anti-environmentalism, not because they actually hate the environment, not because they actually want the climate to change and to cause all this disaster, not because they want to deny science, but because we created an identity level polarizing issue out of one object and alienated them. That's the problem. So this is crucial for this overall psychological part of the conversation. So I wanted to talk about the alienation thing. That was a big one. One of the notes I made was about intervening in the positive feedback loops. That's just like a matter of like conceptualization and perspective. And I think it's really crucial. Is that we're talking about the positive feedback loops, right? Like, what if every time you ate, it caused you to become hungrier? Which actually, there are some things that do that, which is a problem with the whole market with like fast food and stuff anyway. But regardless, neither here nor there. It's critical to throw a wrench into the positive feedback loops. Positive sounds healthy, right? But it's just that's not the same thing. It's about the building of steam, literally and figuratively. You know, one thing they didn't touch on here that is probably going to be part, because this is a 4-part series. Hopefully we're going to be able to stream all 4 parts. There's a 4-part series, is the cascading effects that happen with those positive feedback loops. And, you know, there was a big avoidance of the doom and gloom, which I think is important. One of these is the methane trapped in tundra. So tundra, Arctic tundra, is, you know, global. It's around the entire globe in the northern and southern regions, but a lot more in the north. Within the tundra, because of the temperature and the way that the environment works there, as well as the organisms like the mosses, the peat moss, there's a very slow kind of decay that tends to get trapped. When things decay, one of the things that happens is a production of methane when biological organisms, especially meaty animals, decay. You get a lot of methane that is generated. Now, over the normal course of, you know, climate interchange with environment, with the living natural world, if, you know, there would be this slow adaptability, as they were talking about in here, of, you know, changes to the atmosphere, changes to temperatures, if all of that was escaping when the rot was happening, like it does when most things die most of the world over, right? That's how we have the climate that we have now, in part, and the organisms that we have that do their thing, the fungi, the bacteria, the vultures, things that eat other things after they're dead, before they're dead, like all the processes of the environment, they're all adapted to this natural flow. But one of the things that happens in tundra is that methane gets trapped underneath. So there's a ton, literally tons, many, many, many tons of methane sitting underneath that tundra. Once the climate warms enough, that tundra no longer is frozen. And that tundra thaws. And we suddenly get this massive escape of methane. Methane. This massive escape of methane, which is many times stronger of a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. And you get this sudden explosion, a figurative explosion, and not actual like fire boom boom. The sudden explosion of methane that is released into the environment, and this is a cascading feature. This is part of the positive feedback loop that is a cascading quality, right? Much like hotter temperatures make for drier summers, make for more forest fires, which reduce CO2 sequestering because there are fewer plants, and creates more CO2 because of the burning of biomass. Right? So that's additive in terms of more CO2, subtractive in terms of less carbon sequestering by having more plant life, and both of those things create more a greater greenhouse effect, right? Compounding factors all at once, which in turn makes for even drier summers, which in turn makes for even more forest fires, and so on. This is a cascading effect. This is a positive feedback loop. Same thing with that tundra stuff. So we have to intervene in these positive feedback loops and create the conditions that allow us to kind of wheel that back in. Like what he was talking about is like getting the ball. We don't know if we're on the far side of that yet, but just in case we're not, we need to take action to cause us to not reach that peak that then causes the boulder to roll on the other side. I love this. Every positive thing we do now will have a positive impact on the future. And I think that was a really healthy perspective for the positive psychology of this kind of impact, where it's like, no matter how small, and he talked about the ripple effect, but he briefly touched on, he mentioned it, the ripple effects, we don't necessarily get to see the impact of all of our small choices, like, you know, choosing to not eat meat on a certain day of the week, right? Like every week, it's like we've reduced, it's all vegetables, which is healthier for the environment. You know, the lights off day, you know, it's like it's reduced power. You know, these small incremental changes, gradually making that more and more a part of our lives, you know, choosing to this one's a huge one for me, choosing to fix more of your items at home instead of replacing them by buying another one. Some of y'all may have seen this for me recently when I, stitched up some of my clothes. Actually, I think Rouge Light Girl, I think you mentioned something about that when I posted about it on Twitter. I stitched up some of my clothes recently. Old me would have bought another thing. I'd have been like, I don't want to take the time to do this, and it's so affordable because of fast fashion, which is a epically massive problem when it comes to sustainability. Massive, huge environmental issue. Fast fashion makes clothes very affordable, very cheap, but also break very easily. Try to buy more expensive stuff that is likely to last longer. And I know that the affordability, you don't just magically have more money to buy on, to spend on stuff. But there's actually a really good economic purpose. There's actually a really good economic benefit to buying more expensive things. Two reasons. When they are more likely to, they have a sturdier build, when they are more likely to last longer, you actually end up, and there's some research on this too. You are less likely to spend more money in the long term by buying expensive stuff that lasts longer than by buying cheaper stuff that breaks more often. It's more affordable today to spend 20, 30 bucks on that one thing to replace it. But as it turns out, for most people, because of how frequently cheaper items break or become outdated, and you spent little money on it, you think about it psychologically. You think about it as a more easily replaceable object. So you're like, this is easy. This is just another 20 bucks. And I have 20 bucks because I don't have a ton of money, but I've got enough money to replace this thing today. So throw that thing away because it's not working anymore. It's broken, and buy another one. Turns out you spend more money that way in the long term. You're actually spending more money by buying cheaper products. It's so wild. It's so weird. And part of that is the psychological element, and another part of it is just the build quality of the items themselves. They tend to not be built as well. Now, of course, you can buy a really expensive thing and have it break the next day, right? You can just whip a new pair of pants the same day you bought them, even if they're $8,000. That doesn't necessarily make for good quality. You got to do a little bit of research, but this is a good, positive, and healthy investment. Buying something that you love that is actually likely to last longer also compels you to fix it when it's broken, which causes you to love that item more. You feel a grander sense of connection when you only have a handful of things that last you half your life. And you're like, no, this thing's really important to me. I want to keep this. I want to keep it in good condition. I want to keep it rolling. You spend way less money fixing that stuff up. You feel better about the life that you're living by virtue of the home that you're building up. This is who you are, in part. Now, I know there's a whole Fight Club and Buddhist conversation to be had about the nature of objects and materialism for defining who you are. But I'm talking about these like kind of incremental steps, working with what we have now. You can't just go live on a mountain in a monastery, just like change everything all at once. Most people aren't going to do that. Economies will collapse. It'd just be terrible. It's not going to happen. Totally impractical. So, little steps. If we're just keeping with materialism to some extent, we might as well love the things that we have, fix them when they're broken, and invest in things that we know that we're going to love for a longer period of time, and spend. We will save more money individually in the long run, as well as prevent a lot of stuff from going into the dump, reduce a lot of extra waste and energy expenditure through the constant production of new material. And all of that has really big impacts on the climate crisis over the long term. This is huge. This is a critical one. Highly recommend considering this. You don't have to do it all at once, right? Because how would that even look? What are you just going to throw out all that stuff and then just go buy new expensive items? You can't do that all at once. You can't afford that. And it's totally contrary to the whole concept. We just going to throw all that shit away into the garbage? The whole point is to not have stuff thrown into the garbage. It's part of a mentality that is really important for us to consider when we go to buy new things. That would be the idea. Try and fix some of the cheap stuff that you have around the house so that you don't throw it away. And when you have the money and feel like upgrading or exchanging it out for something else, or maybe it breaks critically and you actually have to replace it, see if you can't put a little bit extra money away in the bank to be able to afford an extra, 30% on replacing that item so that you have one that you want to stick with. You know what I mean? It's about mentality. It's shifting hearts and minds, our own and other people's, and talking about this with, friends and family and stuff, and not trying to make people feel guilty for consumerism. I didn't invent it. It's unfair for me to suddenly have the weight of consumerism and capitalism foisted on me. I inherited this psychological, this mentality. And not even necessarily from my parents. This is cultural. This is a socio-cultural quality. This is where we live in space and time. I don't just get to up and change that. Children don't just get to form all of how they want to just live life and just go out and just do whatever they want. You have these things that you inherit. That you inherit. The enculturation. It's part and parcel with being human. But as adults, we do get to make some intentional shifts. So don't feel guilty about the life that you have lived. You didn't necessarily have the opportunity to help that. Once you make the realization, this is a Socratic thing, you don't really have a choice but to act justly, rationally, and ethically. And you will feel good about it. You don't have to feel guilty about the things that you didn't even have a choice in how society foisted its things upon you, and you were just living your life not knowing the difference. That's not a problem for you on an identity level. That's not you're a bad person at all. But we do get to choose to make adjustments over time when we are fully ourselves. And that is one of the most empowering elements of adulthood, is choosing who we get to become. Sometimes it's a moment-by-moment thing. Sometimes it's big life changes. Sometimes it's somewhere in the middle. Most of the time, it's somewhere in the middle, right? Trying to think about the things that we're talking about today, slowly building them into your life, talking about them with friends and family, not making them feel guilty about it either. Empathy. You also realized this at one point, right? They may not have been there. They may not be there yet. They may not be ready for a little while. Introducing the conversation, just being like, meeting them where they're at. You know what I mean? Where it's like, okay, no, I totally get it. But here's an interesting thought. Here's what this is the way that I usually do it, right? And this is also very just like how I operate, is I've been making this change. I've been thinking about this thing in a certain way, you know? Where it's not like, you should think about this in the same way that I am. My ideas are not fully formed. I'm constantly changing all my stuff. I'm constantly building in new information and research into all my thoughts. I'm constantly having new conversations with people who go like, yes, that's a really good idea, but what about this problem? And I'm like, shoot, I did not think about that. That did not occur to me. I have to re-examine this. You know what I mean? The things that you're, donating to Salvation Army or whatever have to actually be things that people want. They have to actually be in a usable state, and the charity or organization that you're donating it to has to already not have an overabundance of it. What happens very often is that these charitable organizations throw a bunch of this stuff away because it's unusable, right? People donated it when it was because not even just because they didn't want it, it was in great condition anymore. It was because it was like busted or worn out to the point that I wanted to replace it, and so then I donated it to a place. But other people can't make use of it, or if they do, it's on its last legs. And oftentimes it's the same type of thing that's in a really bad condition, but the same type of thing that a lot of people will give. And then you have way more of that one thing at the Salvation Army or whatever these charities, whichever charity you're talking about or organization, they have tons of this one thing that not tons of people are taking. And they have to do something. They can't just continually rent out storage space for all this stuff that people keep giving them that they can't give out to others, right? So it ends up getting dumped or repurposed in some form or fashion. There's a significantly more compelling argument for veganism and vegetarianism over meat consumption in part in land use, but also energy consumption, greenhouse gas creation or emission, and carbon sequestering, where you look at simple numbers, where it takes, in order to get a 1 pound of meat, it takes 10 pounds of vegetables. So something has to eat 10 pounds of vegetables to get that 1 pound for us to be able to eat that 1 pound of meat. That's a 10 times, increase of energy usage, just in terms, right? Because we're eating the food to get energy. That's why the body needs food. So thinking about that energy transference, that's a very inefficient system, right? It's effective. We get to eat as much of that meat as we want. We still get all the calories and the stuff that helps us build bodies and whatever. But it's a very inefficient system. It takes 10 times the vegetables and also 10 times the land. Well, it's even more times the land. But 10 times the vegetables, 10 times the land, just to get that one thing that we get to eat. Right? So looking at just that by itself, you have a much more efficient system. And also matters of water runoff from farming, which is hazardous in a number of ways. for downstream systems and in-stream systems, such as the incredible increase in nitrogen. Is it nitrogen? Whatever. A lot of the stuff that's in the animal byproducts, the waste, just piss and shit, that goes into water systems that then creates a toxic environment in those waterways, which reduces the natural processing and filtration, which then means that we have to do more chemical processing and filtration, and has a lot of other, really negative effects on, the concentric circles out from the environmental problems, like the degradation of the degradation of the water quality in water systems reduces the vegetation downstream. Reduction of vegetation downstream makes the soil more unstable, which causes more mudslides, for instance. That's real flesh and blood human damage. That's real economic damage. That's direct, right? It's just like floods are more likely to happen, period, because of this, right? Floods are more likely to happen. Waterways are damaged. The vegetation is destroyed. The soil is eroded. It makes for not arable land for farming as well. It's just like this whole thing. And this is just talking about factory farming. Or not even necessarily factory farming, but that's like the biggest culprit. Less so with vegetables, simply because of the ratio of energy, right? You can just eat the same amount of calories in vegetables, and it is incredibly efficient in comparison to meat, because of that 10 times ratio or whatever. Now, of course, you can have a lot of toxic stuff when it comes to just growing anything, agriculture in general, right? It's like tons of fertilizer and, tons of pesticides and whatever. But the core counter argument to this one is that because it takes 10 times the vegetables to feed the one cow in order for us to get the food, we're actually using more of that stuff anyway, just to do meat farming, because of the amount of vegetation that has to be grown in order to feed the cattle and pigs and whatever. So overall, even with toxic stuff like pesticides and fertilizers that also poison the waterways, you're using more of that just to get with the factory farming stuff. So it's a smoother thing. It's just a smoother thing to just eat some more vegetables. It's interesting. You can make some incredible meals out of just pure vegetables. Now, a lot of people don't like a lot of types of vegetables. I'm right there with you. I was vegan for 2 years, but I hate green beans. I hate all kinds of squashes, asparagus. Get out my house. Tomatoes, raw tomatoes, no way. Well, okay, maybe a little bit, just a little sample. Sprinkle them in there just a little bit. Vegetable smoothie. There's not many people, including myself, know how to cook veggies taste as good as meat. Absolutely, right. And so this is one of those things too. I have also been in that position, right? And that's a simple matter of that totally innocent ignorance. It's like before you know a thing or how to do a thing, you just don't know it. You simply don't know it. However, we do have this infinite resource of the internet. And now it sounds like I'm talking down. I'm not. We have this infinite resource of the internet. It is you have to sift through some garbage no matter what you're doing. You want to find some streams that are just fun to watch, you got to sift through some garbage. You want to find some YouTube videos that are fun to watch, you got to sift through some garbage. You want to find information on something, you got to sift through some garbage. But you'll get there, right? You can find this stuff. One of the best meals I've ever had was a raw vegan meal, meaning it was uncooked. Now, I'm a meathead, like literally lover of meats. I am a huge fan of lots of meat. Bigly. I like beef jerky. I love barbecue. I'll eat meat. I'm a bottomless pit when it comes to meat. My stomach doesn't know the shutoff. Same thing with candy, which is also really problematic with sugar production. Neither here nor there. Big lover of meat. I love it. It feels like easy flavor. The fat's right there. Just sprinkle a little bit of salt on there. It's delicious, right? It's just right up in there. But if you're cooking food, it turns out that there are just like a bunch of little tricks to just make tasty vegetables. And it's not. Have you ever tried to eat raw meat? It tastes like shit. It tastes like pure shit. It's horrible. Well, okay, not all the time. Like cured meat, great. Most meat raw tastes terrible. How does that get fixed? Cooking it. And a lot of times we season it. We have sauces. We have other things that it goes with. Starches, vegetables, right? You've got your protein in there, but you've also got all kinds of other stuff. Acid, salts, right? You just sprinkling stuff on. You put some olive oil in there, you know? Tons of spices, all kinds of stuff. Think about the diversity of food cultures. There's so much stuff. Make the same consideration with vegetables. I think meat seems easy because of that cultural quality. But vegetables seem really easy in cultures that rely on them fundamentally for a lot of their foods, which is really interesting. If we wanted to have a greater impact on the environmental crisis, just get rid of meat altogether. But that's just untenable. Wouldn't be my suggestion. If I could just snap my fingers and have it happen and everybody just knows how to cook vegetables real easy and we just got tons of them all over the place, sure, I'd totally do it. Farming is one of the weirdest subsidies as well. When people think about like the price of food, the cost of food, meat should be super expensive, but it's not because of the amount of money that our taxes go to pay for the meat. So we're paying for it in other ways, which is a really curious kind of approach to think about it. Now, vegetables would also cost more, but not as much as meat. Meat is super expensive. And if externalities were rolled in, okay, let's talk about externalities for a moment. Externalities is a term that is used, and correct me if I'm wrong, specifically in economics, notably talking about corporate behavior and concepts. Externalities are costs that are not paid by the producer or necessarily by the consumer of a product. If you think about the environmental impact of factory farming, for instance, you know, like what I was talking about with the waterways getting polluted and, you know, you got these like tax subsidies and stuff. When I go to the store and I buy a bag of meat, because I love my meat in a bag, I go to the store and I buy a bag of meat, I'm not paying for those costs. Other people are paying for them elsewhere, like downriver, right? Or 3 years from now when there's a flood in Michigan or whatever, right? It's like, or people, and this is an environmental justice issue, marginalized people who don't have the opportunity to choose where they live. They don't get to vote with their wallet, where they may have in coastal areas or in more arid regions, they may be more impacted by the climate crisis. They foot the bill for the thing that I'm not paying for. For corporations, there are impacts and effects on other things external to themselves that are not rolled into the cost of the product or the cost of the production. So you can think about mining as well, right? Mining's a big one. All these communities have this like extraordinary harm that happens from the mining of all these resources. Like I've got tons of technology. I got technology sitting all over the place. A lot of the electronics and batteries get mined out of the earth, and the nearby communities and the terrain, the territory, the environment nearby has all these pollutants that are like pulled up from in the earth, like toxic heavy metal poisoning and stuff. It's wild shit. And I'm over here with like all my electronics everywhere. I got like 8 billion monitors and stuff, 19 phones, 30 cameras, 12 PCs. You know, I'm right up in there. But the impacts that happen to those local environments, there are usually deals that are struck with the government, the government of the area, that these corporations, they get to do all this stuff. And they don't have to pay fines. They're not going to get sued. You know, they're bringing business in. And this is a good thing, according to, you know, like some Manifest Destiny capitalist progression idea. They're bringing business in there. The people who put the bill for all this stuff that I get, all this technology that I use, are elsewhere. It's not me. It's not my problem. It's not the company's problem. They do this stuff. These are externalities. That doesn't get rolled into the cost. If it did, this phone would be a $12,000 phone. The bag of meat that I eat would be a $50 bag of meat instead of a $2.50 bag of meat. Those costs, based on the externality kind of situation, those costs are deferred. Where we defer them is to future generations with climate change, largely in the broader scale of things. That's that real big issue that we really have to think about. Big topic in environmental philosophy and environmental ethics is whether or not people who don't exist yet should be considered. Right? If that's not a real person, I don't know if they're going to exist. Who is it? What is it? Juniper? Juniper Smith? I don't know that person. I never met him in my life. They don't even exist. Their parents don't even exist. This is a fictional person. There's whole generations that don't exist. Whole generations of fictional people. Why should I care about people who don't exist? Big topic. I'm not going to get into that one so much. But it's something that's worth considering for whether or not I should act a certain way today. And it's not about like, should I dump all my electronics out and just go off the grid? No, I'm not going to have an impact. I don't get to have this conversation with you if I dump all my electronics. I can't stream. I can't have this broader conversation. I get to talk to like 5 people who are also out in the woods, being a hermit like me. That doesn't get to have any impact. We have to work within the situation that we have currently. That's right here immediately. Make small incremental choices on a personal basis. Make big policy changes when it comes to voting, who we get to vote in. Those are very vital. Juniper is a great name. I know, it's a really good name. That's my mythological future human. You know. You don't like sushi? I do like sushi. I do, but you know, it's like I don't like just eating the raw fish by itself. Usually it's like putting it in some, like, you know, a soy sauce, or it's got other vegetables. I love seaweed. Oh my God, I have packs of seaweed just to eat by themselves. Just the packs of seaweed in my pantry. I love seaweed. You know, there's rice in there. You know, sometimes there's the wasabi stuff. There's ways that it's spiced up. I don't really like eating like just raw fish now. All right, interesting point. They didn't talk about that, and I don't know if they're going to talk about it. I mean, again, here's the thing with my degree, right? I effectively have 2 bachelors in environmental philosophy. It's a weird situation because in Texas, which is where I spent most of my life, it's where I got my degree. In Texas, they implemented a policy where they were trying to push kids out of college. And now that sounds toxic. It's not that kind of thing. Their idea was that more kids were spending more time in college instead of getting out into the workforce, right? So it's like, just get in, finish your goddamn degree. Quit spending 8 years, 7.5 years right here for my degree. Quit spending 8 years to get your goddamn degree, get it, and go do stuff. We need the economy to do things. You need to be working, was their idea. So they were like, okay, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna get back to the industrializing, developing country thing. It's all tied in, trust me. Trust me. They had this policy they implemented where if you spent more than 4 years getting your degree, they started charging you out-of-state tuition at state schools, right? One of the great things about state schools is you pay, if you live in that state, you pay in-state tuition, which is very affordable, right? It's like way lower than out-of-state tuition or going to some school elsewhere, private colleges and whatever. State school, low tuition rate, right? Affordable for a lot of people. Not everybody. More affordable, less expensive. So the policy was, I was already in school when they implemented this policy. So if you started college after the policy was implemented, you had to do 4 years or 5 years or whatever, and then you were done, or you had to start paying tons of money out-of-state tuition. If you were already in college when they implemented this, you got a little bit of leeway. Not exactly grandfathered, but you just got a little bit of leeway. So if you already had been doing this, it's not like if I were already 6 years into my degree, I instantly had to start paying out-of-state tuition. You got a few years before it would activate. So I was so in love with environmental philosophy that I kept going back for classes. I was exactly the reason that they implemented this thing. I was like, this is what I want to do, is learn philosophy stuff. So I just kept going. So I basically, so I got to the point where I'm just a handful of credits shy, I think. I may actually be over. of literally 2 bachelor's degrees worth of environmental philosophy courses, which is for that degree, for that course in that school, is 60 credit hours per degree. I think it was 60, not 45. It changed. It depended on which program you're in, but I'm pretty sure mine was 60. So I either have over, under, or right around 120 credit hours in environmental philosophy. So I basically have 2 degrees in environmental philosophy. You can't actually get 2 degrees. You also can't get a minor in it if you have a major in it. So I couldn't get like a major in philosophy and then a minor. Anyway, some of the stuff that I learned, right? Environmental justice was a big issue that we talked about a lot because environmental ethics was the focus of the program. We had one of the top environmental justice philosophers in the world. Oh God, what was that other one? I can't remember. We had the top environmental ethicist in the world teaching there, and a lot of top environmental blah 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 philosophy people in this program. It's top in the world, tied for Twente in the Netherlands. Those are the top 2 schools for environmental philosophy. So, environmental justice was one of the big conversations that we would have a lot, both broad subjects that I would take classes in and just conversations that the students were having, right? Because most of my conversations ended up being with people who were getting their master's and PhD. In fact, I even ended up marrying one of the people who was getting a PhD in environmental philosophy there. Because that was just my crew, right? Like I was basically done with the bachelor's, and I was an older student learning because I had taken so long to get my degree, and I failed out of college my first semester, and then went and started a game development company, and then went and did a bunch of other stuff with my life, and then went back to school. So I was older, and the people who were getting their masters and PhDs, like that was my level of thinking. Like I wanted the deep end stuff, and so those were my friends, and I was just conversing with them. Environmental ethics, environmental justice was a huge thing. So environmental justice is focused around, in essence, matters of justice related to the environment. I'm sure you're surprised. How policy and choices in that affect how the climate shifts and not climate shifts exclusively, the local and global environments and ecosystems are affected by a number of policies and choices, economic decisions, shifts with industry, how they affect different groups of people or classes of people, such as more marginalized, less affluent individuals in different areas. And this was one of the things I was talking about during the presentation that I touched on. Industrialized nations like Europe. Europe isn't a nation. I'm not that dumb. I am kind of dumb, but not that dumb. A lot of nations in Europe, the US, right? Like, we have had the opportunity to go through the Industrial Revolution to build up very powerful economies by virtue of this, what has felt like a natural progression, economically, politically, and socially, all kind of tied in together, to build up these robust nations by virtue of participation in industrialization, right? You get to, build all these factories and build up, your working class and your middle class, which are powerhouses of overall economies themselves. You have all of these entrenched industries, and part of the progression here is also that you get to go from industrialization into service-based economies, and a lot of technological advancement, but you also have just a strong economy itself. Like, a lot of people can afford a lot of things, which is part of what allows for service economies to thrive. So, which is where you're doing less of hardcore industrial production, like building your widgets and, manufacturing stuff, and more of like higher end technological stuff, like programming things, big service stuff, right? So like all of that is possible in part from all of this development that comes from industrialization. You build up that economy, you build up those classes, you build up wealth, both for the nation and for the individuals within it. They can afford, higher education, which allows them to do higher end jobs, which allows you to then transition away from all that production and that industrialized stuff. right? Well, then who's going to make all that shit? Other people. Other people going to make that stuff because we can afford not to. And that's kind of the idea. What happens with things like, the Paris Climate Accord, other environmental agreements, and pressure that is put from industrialized nations like the United States onto developing nations, we say, you're not allowed, this isn't exactly true, but you're going to get the idea. You're not allowed to build up your industry because it's so polluting. We're trying to reduce pollution, and the best way to do that is to prevent you from even starting to become polluters, right? Like major, large-scale, industrialized polluters. It wasn't all that bad to do this back in the day when air was clean. Climate was solid. Climate was totally, pretty on par. We had the opportunity to pump out tons of pollutants, and the world could absorb it. Ecosystems could survive the impact. The climate wasn't starting to shift rapidly. We could dump tons and tons of stuff and grow rapidly. Lots of economic and industrial development without a huge negative impact on the environment. Like today. Turns out it was a huge negative impact on the environment, but we didn't see it that way. And now that we know how these things work, we look at developing nations and go, like, you can't do that. That's bad. We're all trying to save the environment now. And they go, fuck you. How dare you? You got to build up all your shit by totally just like shredding the environment and polluting non-stop. You got to go through 100 years of this stuff to build up this incredibly powerful economy. How are we supposed to? Well, we're just gonna up and just train people to program. They don't have money. We don't have money as a government to be able to build out an education system like you do. The individuals here don't have the money because of our economy, because we haven't been allowed to industrialize, didn't get to that point yet, and now we are. We aren't allowed to industrialize. They don't have the money to go overseas to get a great education, and we don't have the money to build out an education system like you have, to be able to train people to have these high-end service jobs. We don't just get to leapfrog over industrialization and suddenly arrive at a service economy doing high-end tech stuff. That's not how anything works. How dare you who created this environmental catastrophe in the first place, how dare you put limits on us for what we can do? And it's an interesting dilemma. It's a really interesting dilemma. Because, in terms of like, kind of like a specific localized matter of justice, of economic justice, we need to give them what right do we have to say that somebody else can't do a thing? One. Two, what right, well, and genocide's one of those things that we should be like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. We're going to fuck you up. But, a lot of other kinds of things like industrialization, like how you run your economy. What right do we have to do that? One. Two, what right do we have to do that when that's how we got so powerful? When that's how we built up our economies in the first place and created the problem that then prevents them from being able to do it. It's this really weird thing where it's like, we're preventing them from building up wealth that will allow them to create technologies, implement policies, and go through this education process of building up a strong economy to help mitigate the environmental issues that will affect their people, the people who live there, who, if they don't have money, they can't just move when the tides rise, living on coastal regions. They can't just shift their economy with a big influx with a capital injection, with a big influx of money. They can't just they have no agility. So we're just stuck in this really weird position. So like going back to the industrialized mentality, that is the industrialization of education, which is that adaptation, the industrialization, the adaptation of a Prussian education system that is meant to, this is a lot of the standardization stuff, meant to create good little workers who follow the rules and understand how to solve problems within really strict confines. And that is the difference between education and learning. I'm a big fan of learning, less of a big fan of education. It's easy to confuse the two, but education is that formalized system. Learning is anything that you do to acquire knowledge. And you can have systematized learning that isn't education in the way that we understand it currently. You have a lot of really like progressive experimental schools that are happening right now based on some really, really solid research that are doing some amazing things and showing incredibly promising results. Some really fascinating ones in New York too. And you have things like Montessori, all that. It's real interesting. Real cool. Reminds me of a cartoon I saw. A guy in a torn suit sitting at a campfire telling kids, yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. I know. I mean, and there was that interesting point that was made in the presentation there about investment, which is something that I have dabbled in myself. Not personally making investments and like managing my own portfolio, but mandating that my investments, like through the person who manages some of my funds, who also acts as the broker, invest heavily in sustainable business. There's a lot of renewable energy and businesses that are aiming for cradle-to-cradle solutions, which if you're not familiar with Paul Hawken, I highly recommend reading Paul Hawken's books. He's got a fantastic number of books that are about, actually I think one of them might be called Cradle to Cradle. So Cradle to Grave is, well, I think it's more technical and deep stuff, right? But you're like, you make our standard idea about the way products should work is that products and services and how like industry works is that you people go into a factory, they make a thing, then it goes out on the market, somebody buys it, then they use it for a while, and there's some service involved in there, like, maybe it's a washing machine, and you've got people who come out to fix it, maybe you send it back in, get repair parts, whatever, but then eventually it dies, and you cast it off, and it's done. Cradle, grave, right? Start, finish, done. Cradle to cradle is really interesting, because it puts it into a service cycle that allows the product to be part of an ongoing system of processes that keep it perpetually in existence. And this is kind of also going into the ship of Theseus idea of like, is this still the same original object if you've replaced all the parts of the ship? It's like that washing machine, can we build a set of systems around it where it can continue to be serviced and have parts replaced and have those parts also be repurposed into other objects, where everything is part of, it's not exactly recycling, but upcycling is really part of that process. If you're not familiar with upcycling, highly recommend you check that out too. It's like recycling, but instead of making a same tier object, right? So you like take a glass bottle, you melt it down because it's done, you put it in the recycling thing, it goes to the smelter, and then it becomes glass again, you make another glass bottle, right? That's like a totally horizontal kind of transition in recycling. Upcycling allows you to take different objects and convert them into something of greater value. And it's a really interesting and fascinating kind of economic process, concept that I love. And so Cradle to Cradle operates in this same kind of approach where it's like, what if instead of just buying an object where you don't own it anymore, this is one idea that goes with it. Instead of owning the object, you basically perpetually kind of lease it. And that's oversimplification. That doesn't really do it justice, because that comes with a lot of problems. Like leasing, so what, am I not going to just own anything when I don't have any rights over it? Like, I don't get to kick it if I want to? Like, how does this work? No, there are broader things that are all tied into this, which, again, highly recommend reading the books. Paul Hawken. Anyway, I think the one in particular I'm thinking of that's about the Cradle to Cradle is with another author. But it's effectively the same way that leasing an apartment works, right? Like, I have an apartment, I have a landlord, lots of negative things that come along with that. However, if something breaks, I don't have to fix it. Somebody else does that job for me. It's their problem. And if we have really good systems built around this, The replacement of parts, somebody else handles that, and it's all baked into the price that I pay for having the washing machine, right? I don't have to pay extra because it broke. It's just part of the cycle. That washing machine's done. I'm not just leasing that washing machine. I'm leasing washing machine. So that washing machine just breaks and it's unusable anymore. Great. I don't have to pay any extra money. They take it away. I get a new one. There we go. Perfect. I now have a fully functional washing machine just like I did last week. Except it's upgraded. It's got new, cooler features, right? And it starts the same cycle over again from my experience of I just have a washing machine that works, period. Just does stuff. And other people fix it, replace the parts. I don't have to worry about it. I don't have to pay any extra. What happens with that washing machine when it goes away? Maybe they fix it and turn it into one of the new washing machines, right? Maybe I have basically an updated model that was somebody else's old washing machine, and they, refurbished the whole thing with the new technologies, and now it's just in perfect working order. It's part of a setup of systems that allows for cradle-to-cradle operations. It's the upcycling of the pieces that break. It's the upcycling of the objects that are ruined and no longer usable. Hardware as a service. Yes, there are, of course, going to be downsides to it, but it solves so many issues. It really does. It is not perfect. What up, Showtime? But it works. What up, Mandolin? The amount of things that I've looked to repair have been unable to get parts for. Yeah, just imagine if that was just built into the service, right? You go down to, wherever it is you're going to buy that dishwasher or chair or whatever. They are legally responsible for fixing your stuff forever, or replacing it forever. This is just the contract. That's how it works. That's the nature of that industry. That's what we build in. They are responsible for it forevermore. Imagine. You believe in land ownership. That's an interesting way to phrase it. Do you believe in land ownership? There was an interesting conversation to be had about the commons and the destruction of the commons. There are reasons to be in support and against the ownership of land, private ownership. Not an easy answer. Is it manageable? Yeah. Is non-ownership of land manageable? Yeah. Having lands be a commons, is that manageable? Yeah. Does it solve a lot of problems? Totally. Does it create new ones? Yep. Does private land ownership solve those problems? Yep. Does it have its own problems? Totally. Does having commons solve those problems? Uh-huh. It's like, modularity and redundancy as a requirement seems like a good thing to have for me, particularly with manufacturing parts. Exactly. Having a modular setup for the system. Big fan of modularity. Yeah, huge fan. Huge fan. Thank you for your opinion. My pleasure. I made it myself. Handcrafted, custom, bespoke. like what somebody wants to unicorns, like bespoke, organic, handcrafted children. Yeah, it's good.